Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Again, Mike Donnelly here with HSLDA. So we'll get started. Thank you all for joining us this morning for the Global Home Education Exchange Council's Global Homeschooling Conference. On behalf of the Exchange Council Board, I would like to welcome you to today's session, the Policymaker Plenary. My name is Mike Donnelly. I am Senior Counsel for HSLDA, Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and Director for Global Outreach at HSLDA. I'll be moderating our discussion today. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a homeschooling dad of 7. My wife, Patricia, and I have 7 children. We've homeschooled for over 20 years. And I've been serving at HSLDA for almost 15 years in my role here, working with homeschooling families all over the world. GHEX is grateful to our sponsors, board members, and staff who've made this online global conference possible. Please visit our website to learn more about GHEX and visit our sponsor links. We're coming together online instead of as originally planned in the Philippines because of the global pandemic. And our conference theme is Home Education, a global movement, a global solution, which shows that in spite of the challenges we're facing, the global homeschooling community is reaching out to help improve educational opportunities for all children. GHEX has a mission to support homeschooling everywhere for everyone as a fundamental right, regardless of why or how they choose to do it. We believe that every family, parents, and children should be respected and protected to enjoy the benefits of homeschooling. GHEX has been working to connect, encourage, equip, and influence organization leaders, policymakers, and researchers who have an interest in home education for 10 years. This is our 4th global conference. And again, you can learn more at ghex.world. I'm excited about our discussion today, the Policymaker Plenary, and I want to thank our speakers. We'll have about 6 speakers who will have various time up to 15 minutes, and after which, if we have time, we might be able to have a little bit of discussion and Q&A. You're welcome to open the chat window and chat with your fellow participants. You can see the chat button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can also send questions to our speakers using the Q&A function, and they may be able to answer questions for you after their talk. This session is being recorded and will be available for future access. So let's begin. So I'm just wondering, I'm seeing Alexandre's window highlighted. Are you seeing me, or are you just seeing Alexandre during this whole time, Trudy?
I'm seeing you.
You are, okay, so the active speaker is working. Okay, great. Just want to make sure the technical stuff is working. We've been doing this, it's been working very smoothly, but I just wanted to check with that. Great, thank you very much. Okay, so I just want to put a few questions on the table, and I'm going to share my screen here. Which takes a moment to actually get going. Let's see. Excuse me, just a second. Okay. Okay, so I just want to put this on the table. So it's really bears repeating that right now we're at a time which is unprecedented. And at the height of the global pandemic in April, there were estimated 1.5 billion children who were affected by school closings. And so this issue of education, of parental rights, of policy is confronting policymakers everywhere. What do we do about education for our children when all the schools are closed? And even as schools are opening, in some places they're reclosing because they're seeing an increase in cases and things of that nature. Education policy is becoming a major issue. And we're going to be talking about that today. I want to talk philosophically for just a minute about how do you think about homeschooling as a policymaker? If you're listening to this panel, some of you may have heard about homeschooling, some of you may have homeschooled, but there may be some of you who've never heard of homeschooling, you've heard very little about it. And I want to talk to you about homeschooling very briefly, philosophical, because I believe that the way you think about homeschooling after you've had at least a chance to think about it and consider it really can show what you think about or what you believe about how society should function. Should society be pluralistic, or should it be more totalitarian or unitary? What does tolerance mean in terms of being intolerant or tolerant? And what about this idea of being statist or respecting the rights of individuals? I believe that when you think about homeschooling, it puts a number of different issues of education, children's rights, parental rights, the role of the state and the family into focus. And we can look at some of these issues from that perspective. Pluralism versus totalitarianism. Do we believe that we can respect differences, or do we need to kind of try to make everyone conform to one particular state-approved way of thinking or educating in particular, as we're talking about here? And there are a couple of ways of looking at this. If you look at Germany, which has a very notorious policy of repressing the freedom for families to homeschool in the name of, as they say here, counteracting the development of parallel societies and integrating minorities and promoting what they call the learning of lived tolerance. And they say that only public schools that are state approved can perform this function. That's the German view. And they even go so far as to say that people who are motivated to homeschool because of religious or philosophical reasons can be treated unequally, even though there is a requirement for equal treatment in the German Constitution. So on one hand, we have this point of view. On the other hand, you have a freedom-oriented view, I would say, that respects difference. And I like to point to the United States Supreme Court in a case called West Virginia v. Barnett, where the court said this about respecting the differences of people to live differently and think differently. They said freedom to differ is not limited to things that do not matter much. That would be a mere shadow of freedom. The test of its substance is the right to differ as to things that touch the heart of the existing order. If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. This case was a case where some children were objecting to saying the Pledge of Allegiance, and if you'll notice the date, this was during World War II when America was at war with Germany, and some children, Jehovah's Witnesses, did not want to pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States because they felt that that violated their religious convictions. And the Supreme Court here said, look, freedom is significant in our constitutional order. It must be respected. And the court said you cannot sanction children or their parents if that is their conviction. And when you look at universal human rights ideas, you see this in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. So are we going to respect differences and have a pluralistic society, or are we going to require that everyone submit to one state-approved view? What about being tolerant? There are some people who say we should be tolerant and that people who are not tolerant are intolerant. Well, you have some scholars like Catherine Ross, who's an American scholar, who sort of reflects this idea that the state can and should limit the ability of what she calls intolerant homeschoolers to inculcate hostility to difference in their children during the time when they are teaching their children. She makes an assumption that homeschoolers are intolerant without any evidence of that. But this is what the German state has said as well, that because only schools can create people to tolerate one another in this environment of the public schools, we're not going to allow homeschooling. So is that really being tolerant? Doesn't sound like she's being very tolerant of people who homeschool. But when you look at the evidence of homeschooling, Dr. Albert Chang has done studies that shows that really homeschoolers are quite tolerant. And an exposure to homeschooling is associated with more political tolerance. And if you think about it, it makes sense. I mean, homeschoolers are a minority, and they naturally will have a appreciation for being a minority and want the state to respect the rights of all minorities. So tolerance, is it tolerant to say that you can only go to the public school, or is that being intolerant? And what kind of society do we want to live in? What about the state, the role of the state versus the family or the individual? Some, as the German court has said, would say the state must be in charge. Law professor James Dwyer has written a book about this and reflects the German view very well. He says the reason the parent-child relationship exists is because the state confers legal parenthood on people through its paternity and maternity laws. and that it's the state that empowers parents to do anything with children, to take them home, to have custody, to make any kind of decisions about them. Is that the kind of society that we want to live in, where the state is the fundamental force in the lives of everyone? Or, as the Supreme Court of the United States has said, the child is not the mere creature of the state, that parents have a fundamental right to direct the education and upbringing of their children, and that the state may not force parents to accept teaching from public teachers only. Really, what it comes down to is this question of freedom versus control. And so as policymakers, you're making laws, you are exercising judicial authority in your countries. And I want to just put those ideas out there for you to think about. Obviously, we have to paint with broad brush strokes here because time is short. And we're now going to turn to our panelists. I'm very pleased that I can introduce Senator Ted Cruz, who has sent a video message today. And if you could cue that up, Trudy, we'll start with Senator Ted Cruz, who is obviously a U.S. Senator from the state of Texas. Prior to that, he was a Solicitor General of Texas and a Supreme Court clerk.
In light of this global pandemic, new solutions in education are needed now more than ever in our country and across the globe. Because of these uncertain times, families are revisiting the idea of school choice. Just this summer, the Wall Street Journal editorial board dubbed this year the year of school choice. I've long believed that school choice is the civil rights issue of the 21st century. That's why I support the freedom of all parents to decide on the best education option for their families, not government bureaucrats. School choice is the way to ensure that every child has an opportunity to receive an excellent education. It shouldn't matter what your race or ethnicity or zip code is. Every single child deserves an opportunity to achieve. Thank you for the exceptional work you do to empower families and policymakers to fight for freedom and to fight for school choice and the right to homeschool across the globe. God bless you.
Well, thank you, Senator Cruz. We would have liked to have had Senator Cruz here live, but we're very glad to have had a message from him. Also, we have a message from Senator Joshua Hawley, who is a U.S. Senator from Missouri. Prior to serving as a U.S. Senator from Missouri, Senator Hawley was the Attorney General of Missouri. And Senator Hawley and his family homeschooled their children. And I understand that some of you are having some issues with the volume from these videos. You do need to turn your volume all the way up. And I'm asking all our panelists to also mute themselves during the video to minimize any background noise. Trudy, if you could bring up Senator Hawley's video, that would be great. Thank you.
It's a privilege to speak to all of you today, and I want to start by expressing my gratitude to the Global Home Education Exchange for inviting me to participate in this event. They're engaged in important work, promoting freedom and flourishing among children and families and communities all around the world, and I'm encouraged to see so many joining in their efforts. Thanks for having me. Now, as you know, this is a unique moment for home education. The COVID-19 pandemic has thrust this issue into the spotlight as millions of parents around the world became home educators overnight, including my wife Erin and me. Home educators are heroes we have come to learn and appreciate, and so worthy of our respect and support. My view is we've got to continue to promote and protect the basic right of parents to lead and direct their children's mental and spiritual formation, their education, and especially during this tumultuous time. They're going to need help doing so. That's why I recently introduced the Helping Parents During COVID Act of 2020. Now, that was a bill that would have provided immediate financial relief to working families whose children's education has been disrupted by the pandemic. This bill would equip parents with the resources they need to provide for their children and ensure that they can continue to learn and grow even in adverse circumstances. I'm thrilled that all of you are taking the time to engage in this important conversation, and I look forward to continuing to advocate for the well-being of our children and our families in the future. God bless you all for all that you're doing.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. We really appreciate Senator Hawley's comments and his encouragement. Thank you very much. I am now going to turn to Chief Justice Tom Parker. Chief Justice Parker is the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court. Prior to serving as the Chief Justice, he was an Associate Justice on the Alabama Supreme Court and had served previously with the Attorney General's Office of Alabama, as well as serving as General Counsel for the Alabama courts. We are so grateful, Mr. Justice Parker, that you are here with us today. Please share with us. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Let me tell the story of perseverance that we encountered personally in Alabama in order to establish homeschooling. It wasn't a public policy decision made by the state. In fact, just the opposite. It was a change in public policy forced through litigation against education bureaucrats. I was involved in the early battles over homeschooling in the courts over 35 years ago. And we were able to then do something which was unique. Prior to those homeschool battles, I had been involved in a legislative effort that was successful to bring church schools out from under the direction of the State Department of Education. Now, when you think conceptually, in the Old Testament, you see that the king was totally separate from the priest. They were two different spheres of authority. And we see the examples of where a king transgressed into the realm of the priest. There was divine retribution against the king. We take that concept of the separation of two separate spheres between the state and the church and apply it like this. We see it in the taxation laws in the nation, because since the money given to the church is money given to God, there's a implicit recognition that the state has no authority to tax that money, either to tax the state or to tax that portion, to tax the church, or to tax that portion of the income which the donor, the Christian donor, recognizes belongs to God through the concept of the tithe. And so we have that principle in government in the United States, and we then attempted successfully to apply that same principle to church schools, that churches, since they're a separate realm of autonomous jurisdiction, that they were able to conduct their church schools without the interference of the state. Once we were able to get that in place, I then devised a legal concept to allow homeschoolers to operate under the authority of a church. It's in essence a church school, but operated through the homes individually. Now, that said, we found this legal covering to allow homeschooling, but homeschooling per se is not legal by law in the state of Alabama. But because this church covering is so solid and so impenetrable by the state, we are able to conduct homeschooling this way. So this was not done by public policy determinations, but forced upon state bureaucrats who represent the state. And it has been successful far beyond anything I could have conceived. At the time, some 35 years ago when we did this, homeschooling was in its infancy, and it was really limited to individual families. I had no way of being able to foresee the explosive growth of homeschooling, leading to what we refer to as homeschool cooperatives, where groups of homeschool families come together and are able to offer specialized courses. Some parent who is a scientist or an engineer or whatever particular knowledge they might have, they're able to offer specialized courses to the students. The students have group activities and even athletics. And this has totally destroyed the only argument that education bureaucrats were using against homeschoolers in the beginning of the homeschool movement, and that is a claimed lack of socialization skills. Well, it's certainly happening through the large grouping of homeschool families through the cooperative approach. And we're certainly able to see also, I'm personally able to judge who has been homeschooled based at their ability to communicate with adults. That's something that's typical for them. It's not unusual. They look you in the eye, they talk with you without apprehension, in contrast to those who've been segregated with only their own age group in public schools. Now, we see great opportunities ahead as this continues to grow. One thing that we encountered, and I'll use the example of one of my state judges who was a homeschooling family. They homeschooled their 3 children. And when the first child was ready to go to the public university, there was an intense battle to get that university to accept a homeschool graduate. Well, that student was so excellent that there was not the problem getting the second child admitted to that state university. And by the time the third child was ready for college, the university came knocking on the door, wanting that child too. And it's gotten to the point now where the universities have a separate path for admission that's a very viable path for admission for those who are homeschool graduates. They recognize this now. They are not excluding. They're trying to find a way for them to become university students. So it's by our persistence that we've been able to change the the educational bureaucracy and get them either to back off their challenges to public schooling, or as with the universities, to embrace it and work to make it acceptable and conducive in their environment. So Mike, with that, let me just pass it on to the next one that you're going to have.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chief Justice. We sure appreciate your being here. And I would note, we have quite a distinguished panel here. We will be hearing from Russian members representing the deputies of the Duma. We have several officials from Brazil here, senior national officials from Brazil who will be speaking. And Tom, I understand that you actually have a connection with Brazil.
Oh, of course. I speak Portuguese. I've met Alexandre in the past. I have not met Inez. Inez, I studied law at USP for 1 year as a special student. So I have that experience in your country and love for your country. And I'm just thrilled to see what Alexandre has pioneered there and how it's spread to be so inclusive across the nation now.
And so we have, very interestingly here, several countries, one, the United States of America, where homeschooling is legal and has been for many years in all 50 states, although it was a fight, as you mentioned, Chief Justice Parker, it was a battle in Alabama that was settled in the courts. In many other states, it was settled through legislative battles. And right now, in Brazil, as we're going to hear from Alexandre momentarily after we hear from our friend from Russia, we are going to hear about what's happening in Brazil, which is a huge country, a very influential country, and one where there is a very lively, ongoing, positive societal discourse on this issue of homeschooling. So I'll be interested to hear that as well from Dr. Inez Borges, who is an advisor to the Brazilian Minister of Education. But right now I'd like to turn to Alexey Komov, who is a policy advisor for Deputy Viktor Zubarev. Deputy Zubarev is a deputy in the Duma, which is the lower house in the Russian Federation. Mr. Komov is a member of the Global Home Education Exchange Council and a founder of Classical Conversations Russia, which is a curriculum company that serves Russian families. Alexey has been a great supporter of home education in Russia, but in many other countries through his work with the Global Home Education Exchange. And he also happens to speak, what is it, 4 or 5 languages, Alexey?
Yeah, more or less.
6, more or less 5 or 6 languages. Alexey is a homeschooling father, and his wife, Irina, is also a homeschooling personality in Russia. Alexey, please share with us on behalf of Russia what's happening and your thoughts, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to send warm regards from Russia. We have about 0 degrees, but very warm hearts. And I'm indeed advisor to Viktor Zubarev, who is a member of Russian Parliament, State Duma, who sends his best regards to all of you. And he has spoken at the previous conferences. Also, a member of Parliament, Inga Yumasheva, who has spoken at the last Global Home Education Conference in Moscow in 2018. She was planning to speak, but some urgent matters didn't allow her to come, but I'm also sending best regards from her. So indeed, we have friends among policymakers in Russia who support homeschooling. And at the last conference, which we had 2 years ago in Moscow and in St. Petersburg, we also had a very influential policymaker, Yelena Mizulina, senator from Russia, speaking at our conference. And she is probably the most influential person in the area of family policy. And she gave a long and detailed speech on this topic, which was very supportive. So we have some support, but I cannot say that all policymakers share this approach. So there are attempts to regulate homeschooling more than needed, to our mind. And there was such an attempt beginning of this year, but we managed to convince policymakers who were trying to initiate this to stop it. And we have formed a year ago a National Association of Homeschooling of Russia, which represents all the diversity of homeschoolers. And by different estimates, there are over 100,000 homeschoolers in Russia, and this number is growing. And so we went to the State Duma, we spoke with members of parliament, with some experts, with the mass media, and we have mobilized support by the public, by the large audience. We have collected, I think, more than 100,000 signatures through our online petitions platform, Citizen Go. And this have led to those politicians to reconsider their approach. And actually, we stopped this attempt to over-regulate and restrict homeschooling. But we need to stay alert, and we monitor the situation. Yesterday, a group of our representatives went to the public chamber of Russia, where the new legislative initiatives are being initially discussed with the representatives of the public. And they argued in support of homeschooling and rights of the parents as prime educators of their children to give the education which they want, and not the only approved state-imposed or state-sponsored curriculum or ideology, which we have experienced, by the way, as you remember, during 70 years of communist rule in Russia. And homeschooling was banned and illegal during those years. And as you know, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and Lenin and other communist ideologies, they were against the family. And they thought that family is the oppressive institution that has no future in the bright socialist communist paradise that is to come. And they said that women are oppressed by men and children are oppressed, and the leading role of father should be diminished. And those radical thinkers, many of them moved away from Russia in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And many of them have developed their thoughts further in the West through the so-called Frankfurt School of Thought and other institutions. And they have come up with the new type of ideas, saying that the state should be in control of everything. And you know, this ideology is a big threat in various shapes and forms. Even President of France, Macron, has recently argued to restrict homeschooling. And before that, we know Nationalist Socialist Party in Germany has banned homeschooling. And we are happy that after all those difficult times in the 20th century, in Russia, since 1992, homeschooling is legal and it's developing freely. And right now in our classical conversations community, we have communities in more than 115 cities, villages, all over Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. And this is really amazing. When I was looking at the list of those geographical locations, many of them I have never even heard of because they're so small, tiny places, but homeschooling is flourishing everywhere, from Pacific coast, from Vladivostok to Kaliningrad, from Arctic Ocean to Black Sea. It's really amazing to look at the map. Of course, we are not 5 million homeschoolers as you are in the US. We were amazed to hear that it doubled during this COVID year. And it's also growing in Russia, but not that fast as in the US, but we hope to catch up in the future. And so also I wanted to say that we had over last years, we had a huge support, also spiritual support from our dear Father Dmitry Smirnov, who was a very famous priest of the Russian Orthodox Church, which is the main church in Russia, with over 70% of Russians saying that they belong to it. And he has passed away a couple of weeks ago on October 21st. And he was the head of the Patriarchal Commission for the Family, Protection of Motherhood and Childhood. And he was a very, very strong supporter of homeschooling, and it helped a lot to grow this movement. And me and my wife, Irina Shamolina, who also spoke here in other sessions. So we really loved Father Dmitry, and we hope that he's praying for all of us right now. And so we think that homeschooling has bright potential in Russia and globally, and this COVID crisis may represent some opportunities, and we should be really trying to grow and expand it further and continue working with policymakers all around the world and exchange our ideas. And this wonderful global home education exchange offers this beautiful opportunity. So thank you very much for having me here. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexey. I remember meeting you in 2014 in a building that was the headquarters of the Communist Party in Russia, where there was a conference on the family. And we were in a room where the Politburo used to meet, the very top communist leaders of the Soviet Union. And there we were, hundreds of pro-family advocates, and home education and education freedom was being discussed. And I looked around and I thought, is this actually for real? Growing up in the 70s and 80s during a time when the United States and the Soviet Union were in the Cold War, we were enemies. I was in the United States Army. I saw the Soviet Union as an enemy that I was going to fight with possibly. And to look back now, 30 years after the fall of communism in the Soviet Union, and to see a growing, flourishing, one of the largest homeschooling communities in the world is a testimony to what we all should know, which is that parents love their children. They want to do what's best for them. And that doesn't mean that parents whose children are in other forms of education aren't doing what's best. But the point is parents should have that choice. And so thank you for the work that you're doing in Russia, and for, again, and mentioning the threat that we are facing right now from France. Right now, France is ground zero for the battle for homeschooling freedom in the West. President Macron has made that comment. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about that. But again, thank you for your very helpful and informative remarks. And I would like to now introduce National Secretary Alexandre Moreira, who is a dear friend of mine. Alexandre is National Secretary for the Global Protection of Human Rights in Brazil. He is formerly a deputy head of the legal department of the Ministry of Education in Brazil. And he has served as legal counsel for ENED, which is a National Homeschool Association for Brazil, and has been very instrumental in writing and speaking and advocating on the need for freedom and recognition of home education as a right. And so, Alexandre, I invite you now to share with us your experience, and also you and I engaged in a project, which I hope that you'll talk with us a little bit about, the Rio Principles. Alexandre, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mike. It's such an honor and a joy to be here with you again. And, you know, some years ago, a priest visited me, and we were talking about homeschooling, and he said, look, I see homeschooling like an icebreaker ship for the rights of the families. Homeschooling, for me, he was saying, is much more than education. It's about freedom and autonomy from the individual and for the families. That's why it's so much larger than you think, he was telling me years ago. And I believe that. I believe that what we are talking here is not exactly about education, but we are talking here about our fundamental liberties, our fundamental freedoms, our essence as a democratic and pluralistic society. Well, and I will tell you a curiosity. Few people know, maybe my friend Justice Tom Parker knows that Brazil was an empire in the 19th century. We had two kings, and homeschooled was commonplace. We have tutors, preceptors, private teachers. It was very, very common. You know, in the newspapers, we saw ads at that time announcing, I'm available to educate the family, children, etc., etc. It was a marketplace for homeschooling. At that time, the 19th century, we didn't call it homeschooling. We just called it education. And maybe we can stop talking about home education and talk just about education. Because as I stated, I think yesterday, the only education that really exists is at home, not at school. But in the end of the 19th century, our republic was proclaimed, and it was a very positivist republic. And the positivism stated that we need to have order and progress by the state. It was almost a pre-fascist conception. And we saw an escalation of repression to freedom on education, to freedom of the families. And well, we had all the 20th century to discover something. And what we discovered is that the promise of the Republic has failed in Brazil, has failed miserably. And I mean, the promise that if everybody goes to school, we'll have a learned population, we have citizenship, and we have peace and progress. And a lot of families learn it the hard way. And more than 10 years ago, the modern homeschool movement in Brazil began. And we started our association in the end of 2010 and thought, okay, what's our next step? And it's very curious. Mike, I don't know in the US, but in our beginning here in Brazil, we had some anarchists in the homeschool movement. They were just telling us, we just don't want to know about laws, about state. We do whatever we want. We don't need that. Well, I was telling them, you can't say that until a policeman comes into your home. It's not so easy like that. We need the state, we need to convince the state officials. We need a real partnership. And the Brazilian Constitution of 1988 says that education is a duty from the family and the state. The state has a role. And we need to work through the state also. We can't see that this is something that homeschool movement learned in the last years here in Brazil. We can't see our mission as just a private mission, something that we do at our homes. No, this is a political movement. We want to change the state. We want to change the education. We want more freedom, especially recognize it. And what we began to do? Well, several bill proposals, and it was much harder than we thought at the beginning, because there was a very, very persistent prejudice about homeschooling in Brazil. It's a very common phrase here to say that the place of the children is at school. They repeat this all the time. And it became a kind of mantra for educational officers. And we came to recognize that our mission was not to just change the law. Yes, to change the law, it's very important. But our mission was to change the culture. It was to change the perception of the population about homeschooling and the perception of the public officials about homeschooling. Well, I can say that after more than a decade, well, we are doing best. We are doing good at this. What do I mean? Most of the Brazilian population now recognize the existence of homeschooling and respect it. If you go on the streets, the common Brazilian will tell you, oh, homeschooling. Well, I don't want to do this with my children, but if anyone wants to do it, that's okay for me. That's okay. So we can say that we kind of conquered the society. And it's much harder to conquer the educational bureaucrats, much harder to conquer the parliament. But for the first time in our history, we have a president, Jair Bolsonaro, who is an adamant defender of homeschooling. Even before the election, he was a defender of homeschooling. And for the first time, we have a conjunction of ministries defending homeschooling in Brazil. I'm talking here from the Ministry of Women, Family, and Human Rights. All these issues are together here. And we work very close to the Ministry of Education. That's a lot to be done here. But for the first time, we have this recognition in the government. But as several bill proposals are around the country, in the national parliament, in the state parliaments, in the municipalities. But I would like to talk a little bit about what we can call the framework for the law of homeschooling. It's about the real principles of 2016. In the first place, we really are not anarchists, and we value the rule of law. That's very, very important for us. And as we studied together all the international treaties of human rights, we came to understand something. Well, homeschooling is already there. What do you mean already there? We don't see it expressly in the Human Rights Treaty. Well, I mean that homeschool, the right to homeschool, is a natural consequence, a natural derivation of the rights expressed in the international treaties of human rights. I'm telling you about the rights of the family, about the freedom of thought, about the cultural rights, about the educational freedom. This is all stated in the international treaties of human rights. And what we did in 2016, we wrote a declaration. There is nothing new. It was just an interpretation, really a very simple interpretation of these international treaties. And the conclusion for us was unavoidable. The conclusion is that the right to choose homeschooling is a human right. It's already protected in the international treaties of human rights. So I invite everyone to see our real principles. Please, if someone can put the link in the chat. And it can be a kind of, how can I say, a blueprint for national legislations on homeschooling. Because legally speaking, the fight is the same everywhere. The necessities are the same everywhere. We are talking about the same freedoms. And every country can benefit from the real principles, because we know almost every country in the world ratified these international treaties on human rights. So this is not a bill proposal. This is not a project. This is a recognition of a right that already exists in the human rights system. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alexandre. It's one of the most important things that I feel like I have ever participated in with you, and it was a wonderful project working with you on drafting the Rio Principles. And thank you so much for your eloquent explanation of your experience in Brazil. Really appreciate your participation here. Brazil is a very important country in the world. It's a lot of other countries look to Brazil for inspiration, for example. Russia also, people look to the United States also, but it's important to have other countries having this discussion. And there is a very vibrant discussion happening, as you pointed out, in Brazil right now, where you participated in a Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court recognized that homeschooling is allowed, although it said there needs to be some regulation, so to speak. And I just want to say here to policymakers who may be listening, we're not here to tell you how to regulate homeschooling or if you should regulate homeschooling. There's no requirement that homeschooling be regulated. You can recognize it in your constitution, or you can just acknowledge that it exists as a right, as Alexandre pointed out, in human rights treaties and as a function of individual human rights. But we do stand here to say that you have to allow people to do it some way, shape, or form. So what I'd like to do now is turn to our final speaker today, and then looks like we may have a little bit of opportunity for some discussion. Dr. Inez Augusto Borges is a special advisor to the Ministry of the Education Ministry in Brazil. As Alexandre said, he works closely with them. She is an author and also a founder of many civil society organizations in Brazil prior to coming to working for the minister. Dr. Borges, welcome. We're glad to have you. We have a video that we're going to show, and then you'll be able to participate in the conversation as you like. It's wonderful. It's in Portuguese with subtitles, and I'm so delighted that you are able to present in your mother tongue. And I love the Portuguese language. I talk about Portuguese as sort of a combination of Spanish spoken with an Italian accent. That's how I think about it. And it's a lovely, lovely sounding language. So I think our listeners are going to enjoy just listening to you talk and reading the subtitles. So Trudy, if you could please bring Dr. Borges' video up.
É com muita alegria, com enorme senso de responsabilidade, mas também com uma viva esperança, que apresento os cumprimentos do Ministro de Estado da Educação do Brasil, senhor Milton Ribeiro. Em nome dele, cumprimento a todos os organizadores deste evento, estendendo o respeito e a apreciação do Ministério da Educação a todos os demais preletores e a todas as famílias educadoras nas mais diferentes regiões do planeta. Reconhecemos que o Global Home Education Exchange presta um valioso serviço à humanidade, promovendo, conectando, equipando a comunidade global de educação em casa. Eu sou Inez Augusto Borges, assessora especial do ministro Milton Ribeiro, e é, para mim, uma grande honra participar deste evento na condição de representante oficial do meu país. Isto é possível somente porque, graças ao governo federal, o Brasil tem hoje um novo olhar a respeito da educação em geral e da educação no lar de modo especial. O ministro da Educação, em pleno alinhamento com o governo federal, entende que uma nação justa e livre não pode considerar as crianças como propriedade do Estado. Uma nação livre e justa é constituída por cidadãos livres. E somente existem cidadãos livres onde há liberdade de pensamento. A liberdade de pensamento, por sua vez, está incondicionalmente relacionada à liberdade educacional. Por isso, uma nação que pretende promover a liberdade de pensamento precisa compreender e expressar a compreensão de que o direito da criança à educação não exclui o direito que elas têm de receber esta educação de seus próprios pais ou de pessoas às quais a família delega este direito. Sim, o Estado tem o dever de garantir que o direito à educação seja atendido. Mas isto não basta. É necessário garantir que seja oferecida a cada criança a melhor educação possível, reconhecendo que qualidade na educação não é algo subjetivo. Saber ler e escrever muito bem, ter capacidade para interpretar um texto, percebendo nas entrelinhas a intencionalidade do autor, é infinitamente melhor do que o analfabetismo funcional, situação na qual o leitor não consegue, por exemplo, distinguir entre fato e opinião. Repetimos, existem níveis de qualidade na educação e todos que têm acompanhado de perto o trabalho das famílias educadoras é levado a reconhecer que muitas crianças têm recebido no lar um tipo de formação que dificilmente lhe seria oferecida em qualquer outra instituição educacional. Para compreender o papel e a relevância das famílias educadoras, é necessário rever a história da educação, pois essa história tem sido contada de forma unilateral e até distorcida nos livros e cursos que tratam sobre o assunto. Isso porque, nos últimos 2 séculos, a categórica e intransigente defesa da instituição escolar como única alternativa fez com que a educação no contexto da família ficasse à margem da história, assim como tem sido, em muitos países, mantida à margem da lei. Entretanto, historicamente, a educação das novas gerações sempre esteve a cargo da família e das comunidades étnicas ou religiosas dentro de cada nação. É recente a noção de que a educação é, em primeiro lugar, responsabilidade do Estado e que deve ser igual para todos, independentemente das características e interesses individuais e familiares. Essa premissa desenvolveu-se, sobretudo, a partir das ideias de Johann Friedrich Herbert, organizador da pedagogia como ciência da educação no final do século XVIII e início do século XIX. É necessário destacar ainda que a escolarização promovida pelo Estado foi primeiramente apresentada como compulsória e somente mais tarde passou a ser proclamada como um direito. Isto não quer dizer que antes de Herbert a educação em todo o mundo fosse privilégio das classes abastadas ou desprovida de qualidade. Como nos dias de hoje, a qualidade da educação sempre dependeu de múltiplos fatores, incluindo a motivação subjacente às leis, o interesse e empenho do educando, a capacitação do educador, a responsabilidade dos pais, dos tutores e da comunidade na escolha dos mestres e métodos. Muito antes do surgimento da herbartiana e politicamente engajada ciência da educação, a verdadeira e boa educação familiar e comunitária formava eruditos, escritores, artistas, historiadores, cientistas e estadistas. Muito conhecimento foi desenvolvido e acumulado para o benefício de toda a humanidade, antes da escolarização se tornar sinônimo de educação. As ideias de Herbert e seus contemporâneos alemães sobre a obrigatoriedade da escolarização sistematizada foram transportadas para os Estados Unidos por Horace Mann por volta de 1840 e, pouco mais tarde, por estudantes da recém-criada psicologia experimental na Universidade de Leipzig. A pedagogia, portanto, desenvolveu-se de mãos dadas com a psicologia comportamental, desconsiderando aspectos mais subjetivos do ser humano, como a consciência, por exemplo. Influenciados pelas novas ciências, no início do século XX, John Dewey e outros defensores da escolarização compulsória passaram a promover abordagens educacionais com base em resultados de estudos feitos com animais em laboratório. A classificação das crianças por idade, a padronização de currículos, dos materiais didáticos e dos métodos de avaliação foram consequências naturais da trajetória desta cientificização da educação. Considerando que há 200 anos atrás a família era o locus privilegiado do pleno desenvolvimento da pessoa, do seu preparo para o exercício da cidadania e da sua qualificação para o trabalho, parece relevante analisar a qualidade dos frutos da educação nos séculos anteriores, comparando-os com o resultado da escolarização compulsória que vem sendo desenvolvida desde então. Um estudo das biografias de grandes homens e mulheres que marcaram a história em diferentes áreas do conhecimento mostra que a educação no lar produziu gênios como João Amós Comênios, que mais tarde se tornou o pai da didática, como Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Edison, Abigail Adams e Hannah More, entre milhares de outros cidadãos ilustres e pessoas comuns que receberam na família a maior de todas as heranças, a educação com toda a sua abrangência. Não é demais afirmar que educação não é sinônimo de escolarização ou de diploma. Os personagens citados são exemplo disso. Benjamin Franklin, cientista, inventor, escritor, jornalista e estadista, coautor da Declaração da Independência dos Estados Unidos e da Constituição daquela nação, frequentou uma pequena escola paroquial por apenas 2 anos e nunca recebeu um diploma. Abigail Adams nunca foi à escola, mas, tendo recebido uma primorosa educação domiciliar, tornou-se a sábia conselheira de 3 presidentes dos Estados Unidos. As 1.800 cartas que ela escreveu e que estão disponíveis na internet mostram que Abigail Adams foi não apenas a excelente consultora política do marido John Adams ao longo de todo o período revolucionário e também quando ele tornou-se o 2º presidente da nação recém-organizada, mas ela foi também conselheira do amigo Thomas Jefferson, que se tornou o 3º presidente dos Estados Unidos, e foi educadora e influenciadora do seu próprio filho, John Quincy Adams, que tornou-se o 6º presidente daquela nação. 3 presidentes e várias gerações influenciados por uma mulher, fruto da educação domiciliar, sobre quem não é feita nenhuma referência na história da educação. Ao considerar tantos males característicos da era pós-moderna, como a crescente desorientação de crianças e jovens, o desespero de milhões de pessoas, as quais, apesar de diplomadas, não conseguem uma colocação profissional digna, é necessário acolher e incentivar os pais que desejam dar aos filhos uma educação que não é nova, mas que provou sua eficiência ao longo dos séculos. Afinal, os pais têm prioridade de direito à escolha do tipo de instrução que ministrarão aos seus filhos, conforme Declaração Universal dos Direitos Humanos, artigo 26, item 3. Um grande obstáculo na compreensão da educação do lar ou do homeschooling é a falta de clareza na definição da própria palavra educação. Noah Webster definiu educação como sendo o conjunto de práticas e de ações e de disciplinas que visam iluminar a mente, corrigir o temperamento e formar maneiras e hábitos para que os jovens se tornem úteis em sua geração. A educação é, portanto, um direito, mas é também uma necessidade humana. A criança precisa ser educada e, para isso, deve ser respeitada em sua condição de ser único, diferenciado, com potenciais individuais que demandam um contexto adequado para que sejam desenvolvidos de modo singular. Mas, igualmente, a criança é possuidora de certas tendências egocêntricas e antissociais, as quais devem ser limitadas. Portanto, educação envolve um aspecto interno de extrair e desenvolver o potencial do indivíduo, mas envolve também um aspecto externo de nutrição, restrição, direção e controle. Uma pessoa educada é, antes de tudo, alguém capaz de exercer autogoverno, direcionando seus interesses, suas energias e seu tempo e talento na busca de mais e mais conhecimento e na aplicação produtiva do conhecimento adquirido. Sendo assim, é forçoso reconhecer que não existe educação neutra. Toda prática educativa está ligada a uma filosofia, a uma concepção do universo, do ser humano e do tipo de sociedade para a qual o ser humano deve ser educado. É urgente admitir que a filosofia de educação não apenas determina, mas igualmente condiciona a escolha de currículos e de métodos para que os alvos educacionais sejam atingidos. Outro sim, a educação não é uma ciência exata e existem diferentes concepções sobre qual seria a forma ideal de sociedade. Por isso, quando alguém fala em educação progressista ou educação retrógrada, não está fazendo assertivas no vazio, está fazendo referência ao avanço ou retrocesso em direção à concepção específica de sociedade, e isso com base em suas próprias convicções ou influenciada por outros, e não com base em evidências inquestionáveis. Portanto, seria correto fazer com que todos fossem obrigados a perceber como ideal a mesma forma de sociedade e, assim, a mesma forma de educação para que este tipo de sociedade fosse alcançada? Tal percepção compulsória poderia ser chamada de emancipadora? Então, é necessário que seja feita a pergunta: a educação nos últimos séculos tem progredido ou retrocedido em relação a quê? Qual o tipo de sociedade para a qual as crianças estão sendo educadas? Para qual forma de vida nós, como famílias e como representantes da nação, desejamos conduzir as gerações que hoje dependem de nós? Famílias e sociedade civil precisam ser chamadas a refletir sobre esta questão. Não é possível desvincular educação de ensino. Quando, na escola ou em casa, uma criança está estudando história, botânica ou gramática, ela está sendo educada. Os conteúdos nunca são neutros. Há mensagens em cada frase, mesmo aquela que parece ser destinada apenas ao estudo da ortografia. Não é em vão que a legislação fala em temas transversais, os quais perpassam todas as disciplinas e conteúdo acadêmico de forma intencional. Portanto, se a educação não é neutra, se educar é conduzir, dirigir, restringir e governar, então é urgente que a nação reconheça a impossibilidade de conduzir toda uma geração para o mesmo lugar e continuar sendo ainda uma nação livre. Se não houver liberdade educacional, todos estarão sendo preparados para a servidão. Não existe educação para a liberdade e para a igualdade ao mesmo tempo. No contexto de liberdade, as diferenças aparecerão, e no contexto de igualdade, a liberdade desaparecerá. Educar para a liberdade ou para a desumanização? Este é o principal dos desafios globais colocados diante de todas as nações neste período pós-pandemia. A educação familiar é, certamente, uma resposta que precisa ser ouvida e não pode deixar de ser considerada como alternativa de solução global para os desafios globais. O Brasil caminha para a legislação desse tipo de educação. Milhares de famílias têm lutado por isso já há algumas décadas. Alguns projetos de lei estão sendo avaliados com muito cuidado e esperamos, muito em breve, passar a registrar na história da educação brasileira os resultados da luta dessas valorosas famílias educadoras. Muito obrigada pela preciosa atenção.
Thank you, Dr. Borges, for that powerful contribution to our conference proceedings. As you can see in the chat, people are just absolutely appreciative, and thank you so much for that excellent presentation. And please, I welcome you to, if you have just to say hello, if you have any final comments you'd like to say.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you very well. Thank you so much.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here. I'm honored and I'm inspired. All this week long, I have been listening to many glorious messages from people around the world, and I'm very inspired. I'm so thankful to God because I am here because I want to do something for my country, for the nation. And I think this work you have been done, all of you, this glorious work is so important for this time, for this era. And I think this year is a turning point for the history of education. I understand this pandemic is a providential issue, and we are in the middle of a providential history, not only in Brazil, but in the world. I think the children of the new generation will be different from our generation because there will be more freedom to learn, more freedom to be a child, more freedom to be parents, and the nations will be different. I hope and I pray for that. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you. That is an inspiring message, both your recorded and the one you just gave us. Thank you so much for that. Indeed, home education is really, it's a freedom movement when you think about it. It's about respecting the freedom of families, of parents, and the lives of their children. It touches on so many issues relating to the role of the state, as Alexandre pointed out, and as you beautifully pointed out in your prepared remarks. And all I can say is Brazil is fortunate and blessed to have you and Alexandre and others who are in positions of government working to serve the Brazilian people and to advance educational opportunity for all the children in your country. And Brazil, as I said before, is an example, and you are an example to us. So thank you for your remarks. I would like to open the discussion. We do have some time. We're scheduled for another 45 minutes. We probably won't take all of that time, but I think we could have some discussion. And so I invite our attendees to, if you have any questions for our panelists, they're still with us, thankfully. Please, you can chat those into the Q&A function. And I would like to open the floor to the panelists, if any of the panelists have questions for each other or any comments. Does anyone? Or any comments that you would like to make about any of the discussion so far?
Mike, if I may, please.
Yes, please.
I presented how our beginning was a legal battle, and that was 35 years ago. Since then, the studies have been developed to show the success of homeschooling in terms of educating students and preparing them not only for life, but for universities and on beyond. So you can see a different approach occurring in Brazil, how they are really able to utilize the foundation that's been laid, the experience that has accumulated, and to convince on a philosophical basis their government officials that this is something worthy of pursuit.
Absolutely, and that is the purpose of the Global Home Education Exchange. That is the vision we have, is to spread this information, to share this information, to provide a platform for policymakers, researchers, and organization leaders to access this information so that these ideas can flourish, can proliferate. And I hope in Brazil that the work that we've done in the United States and our partnership through the Global Home Education Exchange has helped. And Alexandre is nodding his head. Alexandre, please.
Well, as I said yesterday, when I look to the US situation on homeschooling, it's like looking through a time travel machine. You are our future in home education and the freedom of education. That is very important for us to learn from your history and to know that it's possible, even if that takes time. Well, we have all of our lives for it.
Yes, indeed, it can take time, and hopefully it'll take less time for you than it did for us. And there are other countries that I think will benefit from what you do. In fact, I know that that is true. Even Germany, I think if Brazil is successful, it will have an impact on the situation in Germany, which is proving to be a very difficult, challenging nation to convince that they need to change their public policy. Every nation is different. We respect the national sovereignty of nations and their authority to regulate and to exercise their own control of their own affairs. But at the same time, I think as human beings, we can encourage one another to respect the inherent dignity that exists in each one of us, and also that exists in the family as a fundamental institution of society. We have a question from our audience here asking if in Brazil and Russia, if you can tell us how much you estimate home education has grown this year. I'm guessing in specifically responding to the pandemic. Do you have any idea in Russia or Brazil? We know in the US that it has probably at least doubled from 2 to as much as 5 million children, which is going from about 4 to almost 10% of the school age population. Alexey, let me ask you first. Do you have any idea?
We don't have exact figures, but we feel that probably by 20 or 30% homeschooling has grown this year. But Russians are not so adventurous and self-relying as Americans, and it takes more time for them to change their lifestyle. So we try to promote this idea among Russians, but it takes time. So they're not so fast switching as in the US. Yeah.
Thank you, Alexey. Alexandre, do you have any idea?
Okay. In Brazil also, we don't have official numbers about homeschooling, but my personal estimate based on what I'm seeing on the demands of the family, it's that at least 50% increase.
50%. Well, I mean, there's no question that it would be growing everywhere under these circumstances. And it's exciting. And we appreciate everyone's participation here. We have another question about how many politicians do you know standing with homeschooling? You know, I'll just take a quick stab at that, and maybe Alexey and Alexandre and Dr. Borges, of course, we invite you to participate. It appears, you know, both Alexandre and Inez are appointed officials. So perhaps the question is how many elected officials or elected politicians stand with homeschooling. In the United States, there are very many, easily majorities in most state legislatures and probably the federal government, although in the United States, education is a state matter, not a federal government matter. And that's different from Brazil and Russia, where both the Brazilian and Russian constitutions, I think, give authority to the national government, and they are more national and less federal in nature. So Alexey, what do you think? What would you say? Could you put a head count, or is a head count even the right way to think about it?
We know for sure that maybe 10 members of parliament and senators are friendly to homeschooling, and those are the ones with whom we personally have interacted and discussed this. Others, probably they have heard of it, but it wouldn't be on top of their minds. It's not the top issue for them, and they may have different ideas. So we still have the Communist Party, which has probably 15% maybe in the parliament. They would tend to be more in favor of state control, and they will be reluctant to give more freedoms to parents. The ruling United Russia Party would be more for freedom, theoretically, but also they have this many people have this historical attitude of state being strong. And in Russia, you know, having such a huge territory and cold climate in large parts of Russia, we historically needed to centralize efforts. So people tend to rely on central efforts of government to survive. And so I would say probably overall, maybe 1/3 of all politicians may be rather favorable towards homeschooling theoretically, but they wouldn't have it on top of their agenda. Others would be neutral, and maybe another third could be more hostile than friendly due to the lack of knowledge about what it is, I would say.
That's very interesting. And it seems that, however, even though the numbers who are actively favorable may be small, some of them are fairly influential people in the leading, committees of the Senate and the Duma. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. So as I said, Yelena Mizulina probably is the most influential person, and she has spoken very favorably at the last Global Home Education Conference. And some others, members of parliament and Senator Margarita Pavlova has spoken at the opening plenary of this conference. So we have some influential supporters indeed. But you know, in history, it tells us that it needs only 10% of dedicated people that are motivated to change everything. So the majority is neutral, and they don't have strong ideas on issues. It's always 10% versus another 10% that are mobilized, that change the attitudes. So it's enough to have a small group, but influential, and people with strong ideas, and it will be enough to change the situation to the better, yeah, I think.
Thank you, Alexey. Alexandre, Inez, do you have any comments?
Well,
Inez,
right
please.
now,
let me recognize Inez first, Alexandre, then we'll go to you.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Inez.
Okay, thank you, Mike. I was thinking about how many politicians I know. I don't know so many, but even though some of them are very committed to go along us in this new thought about home education. Our ministry is very committed to this idea. I'm here talking on behalf of him, and this is very exciting because it's an authority in the education of Brazil, in this ministry, and this is very important. Now we need to connect with the other politicians and educators, but in my view, the more difficult challenge we have to face is give information. In these last days, I have been meeting with some educators, even Christian educators, who has no idea what home education is. Some of them just think that when family is in control of the education, they are placing the children in a very, very different context, far from culture, far from every other people in the world. And some think that home education is a danger for children. And I heard this from people in politicians, from people in the board of schools, and we have this work to do. We have to write and to do many conferences like this in Portuguese. I record the video in Portuguese, thinking it will be important to send politicians and to send the video to educators, to people on the board of association. Yesterday, I heard from a representative from the a big association of Christian education, institution of education, and his ideas of home education was so terrible. So we have to I forgot the word. Sensibilizar. Help me, Alexandre.
Sensitize.
Sensitize. Thank you. We have to do that. We have to sensitize parents, researchers, and politicians too. So thank you for this opportunity again.
Oh, thank you. And Alexandre, as I turn to you, I just want to point out there is so much content at the conference website now. We are over halfway done. Our research track has been very vibrant with lots of good information from our researchers. I want to encourage people to go ahead and watch some of the other videos that we have. And your video, Inez, we will cut your video out, and we have it, and we'll make it available. I know that Inez and other organizations will want to point people to that. In fact, we've had requests in the chat already to have it translated into other languages, which we will do. We will have your speech translated into other languages, and we will promote your speech because it is one of the most powerful speeches I've heard ever on homeschooling, and we're very grateful for that. So yes.
Amen.
So Alexandre, as you talk about politicians who are in favor of homeschooling, can you also talk about this issue that Peter from the Netherlands is asking? He says, we've tried to give information to officials, but they don't pay attention to it. They just ignore it. How can homeschooling advocates influence people like you, people who are in positions of power, to make policy? So as you talk about the political landscape, maybe also talk a little bit about how to influence the bureaucracy in Brazil and generally in government.
Okay. Well, maybe the surprise is that there is no secret about how to convince bureaucracy or politicians. It's the same way how you convince everybody. Some people have very deep prejudice about education and about homeschooling, and it's useless to talk to them. Some people don't know anything about homeschooling, but has a more broader mind. You can really talk to them. And there is no option. You have to talk to them. You have to demonstrate logically, legally, and with facts about homeschooling. This is a work of talking to people, listening and explaining to them.
Well, we've found that to be true in the United States. It is a process that takes time, for sure. And I've traveled hundreds of thousands of miles to advocate for homeschooling globally, and I have been to Germany many times. And I've encouraged them. I've tried to encourage them. If I was a German parent who wanted to homeschool, I would easily be discouraged. And I would probably do what most have done, which is flee the country. It's so interesting, the cultural elements that are at play when we look at Russia, we look at Brazil, the United States, we look at Germany, other countries in Europe. There's a cultural element that is hard to put your finger on in terms of explaining what it is and where it comes from. Why is Germany so different than Brazil or Russia or the United States? That there is just a refusal to allow, even with regulation, they could easily pass laws like in France. In the French regulation system, requires inspections from the local authorities and also the National Minister of Education. Now, I don't think that's a good approach. I don't think homeschooling needs to be regulated at all. Now, I'm not saying, if people want to pass regulations, go ahead. The state can do what it wants to do. In a democratic society, we decide for ourselves how we as a society want to regulate and also at what level. And in the United States, we have many states with a combined population of about 125 million people, where families do not tell the state anything about whether they're homeschooling or not. That's over a third of the population of the United States. In at least another third, maybe more, maybe another 40% of the families, maybe 50%, all they do is tell the state that they're homeschooling. There are no requirements, there are no tests, there is no required curriculum, none of that, none of it. So probably 2/3 of the United States population, the regulation is simply nothing, no contact, or simply informing, which, very different from other places. That's the United States approach, but I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Now, there are other states that do require some testing, require that it be submitted either annually or every 2 or 3 years to demonstrate that the children are being educated. But let me ask, Inez, let me ask you or Alexandre, if you want to comment on this. Maybe you don't want to because you're in the process of trying to figure this out, but what do you think about that? Do you have an opinion or a view on regulation, or do you have an idea about what's going to happen in Brazil in terms of the kind of regulation? Alexandre, why don't we start with you?
Okay, Mike. Mike, I have to go now due to an official commitment, but I'll tell you that regulation is something very open to the national reality. It's not one size fits all. We don't have a model regulation for the world. My point of view, philosophically speaking, it's the more freedom, the better, with some kind of afterwards evaluation. I think personally that this point is important. But this is a matter to be negotiated in each country by each homeschool community. The rights, the struggles are the same, but the legal framework is the result of the local necessities and the local views about homeschooling.
Well, thank you, Alexandre. And with that, we'll acknowledge your final contribution, and we'll turn to final contributions from our other panelists, and then we'll wrap up our time together. And thank you so much, Alexandre. We really appreciate you being part of our conversation today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So as we wrap up here, Inez, would you have any final comments? Do you have any thoughts about this issue of regulation? And also,
Yes.
yes, please.
Yes, I do. I have been studying American history for 10 years. And I love your history. I really love your history. I went to Virginia and I stayed at FACE, Foundation for American Christian Education. And I went to Plymouth and I stayed with Dr. Paul Gelli in Plymouth Rock Foundation. And I also translated two of his books into Portuguese. And one of them is, we titled Educação por Princípios, Fundamentos for, Fundamentos de Currículo Escolar, Fundamentos for Curriculum. And in this book, in Dr. Gelli's book, in At Face, I saw how wonderful would be if you had freedom to just teach our children. if you have time to enjoy this context of learning, in teaching and learning without any regulation, because children are curious, children are eager for understanding, for knowledge. And if we are not concerned with texts and forms, a few forms, if we are just trying to teach and the children are just enjoying learning, it will be wonderful. It will be a perfect situation for homeschooling. But here in Brazil, we have to do slowly. We have to go step by step. And I think in a short time, we will have some kind of regulation, some schools that can receive children and see children once in a semester or twice a year, and maybe one test for a year. We are studying the proposals, and I am just now writing about this to have some other partners signing the same paper to present the bill. And so pray for us. But this some regulation will be necessary, and I think it will be better than nothing.
Well, in many countries, it is much better than nothing. So, you know, we encourage you to continue your work. We thank you very much for your powerful contribution to the conference proceedings here in our Policymakers panel. And we wish you and all of you in Brazil the very best wishes as you move forward with trying to figure out how you're going to address this issue with your national Congress. So thank you again for your participation and your contribution. Thank you. So as we wrap up our time together, Alexey, last final quick comment, if you have any.
Yes, there was a question, I think, about how Russia and Brazil influence their surrounding countries in the region in terms of homeschooling freedoms. So I can say that in Ukraine and Belarus and Moldova, there are communities And in the beginning of this session, I received a call from my Ukrainian colleague who was telling me that they're growing. And then I had to stop the conversation. I will call him back and ask how fast they grow in Ukraine, the number of homeschoolers. In other places, homeschooling is not so much developed. We were looking for some communities in Kazakhstan, but they didn't materialize on a big scale yet, but we're still trying to help them start. So I would say surrounding countries are looking at Russia as some sort of example, at least some of those countries, and they use it as one of influential reference points. I'm sure Brazil is such an example for surrounding countries in South America as well. And I think it's important to protect homeschooling freedoms everywhere, because, for example, some other countries may look at France and it may go beyond Europe, given the status of France. So I think it's important really to have homeschooling freedoms everywhere. And we cannot say, oh, okay, let the French do what Macron wants to do. It's not the right approach. So I think we should be all, spreading the right information about homeschooling, so politicians and policymakers understand what it is. And the best example, as Mike Ferris said, is our academic results of our children. So if we show our children and their brilliant academic results, that's the ultimate argument. So we should be focusing on this, and then homeschooling will prove that it's a great thing, and then more and more people and countries will be joining in our movement.
Excellent comments, Alexey. I thank you for those comments. Very good points, all of them. And as we wrap up here, we have a question from one of our attendees that I will answer as we wrap up our Policymaker plenary session, our fourth day of the Global Home Education Exchange Conference, the fourth conference in 10 years of the Global Home Education Exchange Council's existence. Our mission is to advance the idea that homeschooling is a right, that every family and all families have a right to enjoy homeschooling, no matter why they do it, no matter how they do it, regardless of how a government regulates. It must respect the parents' rights and the children's rights to be involved in this kind of education that has proven to be successful, to generate excellent academic, social, civil outcomes. All of that is without question. Policymakers in countries like Germany have absolutely no rational basis to argue that homeschooling should be prohibited. When you look at the experience of countries like Russia and America and even France and others, although there is a discussion happening in France right now. And I agree with you, Alexey, that it is important for us to work together as a global homeschooling community to equip our organizational leaders. That is why the GHEX is a regional framework that is developing and growing, and that people who are attending here who are homeschool leaders can participate in as members of regional committees. We need to work together. We can share our knowledge, our experience, our resources, our information. There isn't any questions that have been asked that have not been answered, which is to say that all questions about homeschooling have been answered. We know the answers to these questions. Socialization, we know the answer. Education, academic outcomes, we know the answer. Civil outcomes, emotional development, we know the answer. They are positive. There is no question about that. And so policymakers who want that information, it is available. But at the end of the day, it's also about this idea of helping policymakers think this through, because they are conservative in some respects, and they have their own ideas about things. And sometimes it can be difficult to change their minds, which is why the Global Home Education Exchange has a advocacy arm where we're reaching out to policymakers to try to provide them with information and to make argumentation. And the attendee here suggests that some homeschoolers should become candidates or prepare candidates to be part of government. And I could not agree more. It may be difficult in a country where the community is small, but in the United States, we were small to begin with. and it happens at the local level, and then you grow and you grow and you build on top of that, and over time you can put candidates in office, you can elect candidates to national and state positions who have influence over policy, and you can't avoid connecting with them. So I would encourage persons who are in this session who have not watched our other sessions on lobbying and advocacy to watch the sessions we have on lobbying and advocacy that were in earlier days. And finally, our research outreach is very important. Policymakers need research, they need information, and so that's something we are taking on here at the Global Home Education Exchange to provide research and a place for researchers to gather for this purpose. So again, on behalf of the Global Home Education Exchange Council, I want to thank our presenters, our very distinguished panel of senior government officials, Chief Justice of Alabama, National Secretary of Human Rights, Special Advisor to the Minister of Education in Brazil, and a representative of the representatives of members of the Duma in Russia, three very influential countries bringing their experiences here today. Thank you so much, Inez, Alexey, Tom Parker, Alexandre. Thank you for your participation. Thank you to our attendees for your participation today. This session was recorded, and it will be available at ghex.world and at the conference website. So thank you for your participation. Thank you, all of you, and